It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Arnold Leibovit. Hi, Arnold. How are you? Arnold or Arnie?
Arnie is fine for me, Douglas.
Okay.
So good to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. And you came through my friend Stu Showstack.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you to Stu. I enjoy listening to his show. Have you been on his show?
Oh, yeah, many times.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So you're here to talk about Puppetoon, which is something that George Pal did back in the 1940s. Was that the right timeline?
Well, he started in the 1930s. He was born in Hungary and did these commercial story films in Europe and worked quite a bit in Europe in a number of countries. He was called the Walt Disney of Europe. He became very well known doing these films. Invented a new kind of stop-motion animation process, which I can talk about, and eventually got the attention of people in the United States, Walt Disney, Paramount Pictures, and they eventually brought him over, and he did his Puppetoons at Paramount from 1940 to 1948. But originally started doing these back in the 1930s. So about a 20-year period, he was doing stop-motion animation, Puppetoon animation in Europe before he, in general, not in Europe and the United States. That was before he started making his feature films, which a lot of people know more famously, The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, and many other big science fiction films.
So this is a restored DVD.
Blu-ray,
okay. And this came out in 2013?
Nope, this one is a recent one. Now, that was my first one. I made the film, originally I made the Puppetoon movie in 1987, and that 2013 was a restored version, but that actually is being redone now. These are more of his Puppetoons, special arrangement with Paramount Pictures from their successive negatives, restored to their great splendor from their original Technicolor successive negatives that many people haven't seen in generations. So that's what this one is. It's the volume 3. I did a volume 2 in 2020, and the one you're referring to was the first release of the remaster of the Puppetoon movie in 2013, and that's actually being redone now. I'm working on an upgrade of that. So
okay, these were short animated features.
These were short films. Pal came up with the idea of replacement figure puppets, stop-motion animation. His idea was for every frame of film, he created a separate puppet. It's not like King Kong where you have an armature, where you're animating an armature, let's say, like Ray Harryhausen did with his films, who worked, by the way, at the Puppetoons. He got his first job working for George in Hollywood. And the Puppetoons are a very unique technique, very stylized form of stop-motion animation, because you have thousands of separate puppets replaced for every frame of film.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's rather complex and quite amazing and almost impossible to do today. People are familiar with the Gumbies, and I had Gumby and Pokey in my remake that I did, my 1987 movie. But that's a clay figure, and as I mentioned, the difference is between taking a single armature like Gumby. King Kong is the best thing most people would remember, and manipulating that figure in it's called an articulated armature, and it's done by the artist. He manipulates it frame by frame. But Pal's technique was the series puppet, which was quite unique. And the only one that's really done it recently in any way was Tim Burton when he did Nightmare Before Christmas, which had that technique used. I was there when they shot that film, and Puppetoons were a great influence on him as the Puppetoons have been a great influence in just about everyone in the motion picture business, including the great filmmakers of today, because George was sort of an expert in the field of special effects. And stop motion animation is just a form of special effects, like stop motion, time-lapse photography, and other forms that now has become CGI animation.
Right.
So,
well, the one that I remember as a kid that I believe was stop motion, I think it was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Well, Rudolph was a Rankin Bass done. That was done in the 50s. That's stop motion animation, but again, that's a single puppet. The way that Rudolph is done, that's the newer technique, where you're taking a single puppet, it's in an armature. It's fairly crude. I mean, in comparison, this is why seeing the Puppetoons is such a revelation, because people see these things and they're jaw-dropping. It's a tremendous shock to both filmmakers and the general public, because what they see is so believable and so real, and in Technicolor, it looks unlike anything you have ever seen before, because of the unbelievable technique that George did with the Puppetoons. It's an amazing thing to see, and as I said, for people who have never seen it, to see the Puppetoons for the first time and now restored, because you've never been able to see them before, really, like this. It's really an experience. It's like a new frontier, for people. But even back in the 1940s, when the Puppetoons were seen in theaters, even at that time, it was a revelation, because no one had ever seen anything like this before. You had musicals and dramas and westerns and black and white movies, and all of a sudden this 8-minute color Technicolor Puppetoon comes on the screen. And I've talked to people who were alive, who were in theaters to see it at the time, and it was a real treat for the audience. They had never seen it before. They looked forward to the Puppetoons. They have a musical element. George utilized jazz and orchestral music. He used the greats of Louis Armstrong and Peggy Lee and all the great performers, and everyone, a lot of people because you're in the music business of the period. I mean, all these people were involved. Duke Ellington, Woody Herman, Andre Kostelanetz, David Raxon, who did Laura. I mean, everybody in the music industry was involved with George. He had a wonderful sense of music, and the use of music with the Puppetoons and these amazing flights of fantasy stories is really, really quite unique. They're very special, very unique, unlike anything has ever been done in the history of animation, which is why they're so special.
So these would have generally been shown at the theater before the feature, like a little short before the feature? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. They'd show a newsreel, and they would show a Puppetoon. The way it worked, though, is because it was this stop motion approach, it was very time consuming to do these films. It took, in an average day, because of Technicolor, the lights of Technicolor were very, you had to shoot in that process, required a lot of light. So you had to shoot each frame 3 times, one in red, one in blue, and one in green.
Oh.
And it took a full minute to expose a single frame of film. So a single frame in the Puppetoons is 3 full minutes of time. So in an average day, they would maybe get 16 seconds of animation. And it took 7 months to do just an average 8-minute subject at that time. And that didn't include all the preparation, the artwork, the drawings, the music, the voiceover, the production, the sets. It's really unheard of, really, in terms of the time involved in doing it. That's another big part of this. It's a marvel because you're seeing something that's an anachronism. It's not possible anymore due to costs, just the sheer doing of it. So that's what makes it so unbelievably unique. It's really worth seeing. People are amazed when they see these things.
Well, I'm amazed that they could even justify the cost back then. How many people would it have taken to make an 8-minute film?
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds. And he was the first one to set up that studio in Hollywood. He did it on Macadam Place in Hollywood. The first one, of course, was in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and in Germany. He worked at UFA Studios, which was the biggest studio in Germany at the time. He was always one step ahead of the Nazis that invaded. That was a big part of his story, eventually escaping the Nazis. But coming to America, he set up this big studio with maybe 100 number of people working in the shops, woodworkers and doll makers and craftsmen from all over the world. George brought in people. George was an equal opportunity employer. He had people from all walks of life, different countries, different cultures. He had women working there at the studio. He had all people of all kinds. That was the wonderful thing about it, is he had all this great creative atmosphere, you know. And I knew a number of the Puppetoon people that worked there. Ray Harryhausen was a friend of mine. People know him from Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts and so forth. I just did a big interview with the Ray Harryhausen Foundation in London about it just last week. And Ray learned a great deal working on the Puppetoons. Willis O'Brien, who did King Kong, he worked for George doing Puppetoons. Disney animators work there. Fred Moore, for instance, who was the creator of the Seven Dwarfs and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The Mickey Mouse that we know from Sorcerer's Apprentice and Fantasia, the great look of Mickey. He created the design for the cover of this Puppetoon. Judy, Punch and Judy, is a Fred Moore design. So we had Disney artists working there. Walter Lantz, who did Woody Woodpecker, was a good friend of George. He helped at the Puppetoon studios. Walt Disney helped there. I mean, it was this unbelievable period of energy, of beautiful creativeness that was happening in Hollywood at the time. So there's a great history involved with this whole period. It's a wonderful period. It's a wonderful, rich part of the history of the motion picture and cinema. And these play a big, pivotal part of that history.
Well, he must have made quite a few of them, because you've got enough material to make 3-volume compilations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I would say he probably did over 100 Puppetoons easily between Europe and the United States. In terms of, and I've been trying to pull together these over the years. This last volume is definitely the creme de la creme. I mean, it's 5 hours of material. It's 28 Puppetoons. It's got 2 of the Dr. Seuss's that he did. He did the first Dr. Seuss films that were done. 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, and To Think I Saw It in Mulberry Street are on this. He has Duke Ellington, like I mentioned, Date with Duke. 4 of the Academy Award nominated films are on this. And the Puppetoons won the Academy Award in 1944 for the creation of this whole technique. And George, of course, went on to win many other Oscars with his feature films, like Time Machine and War of the Worlds and When Worlds Collide, and the list goes on. But so there was a lot of great notoriety. He made a lot of these films. He was very well respected by Hollywood community. And the reason is he was doing something so different than what, say, Leon Schlesinger was doing at Warner Brothers, who, by the way, loaned him Bugs Bunny, who's in one of the Puppetoons. The first time Bugs was ever used outside of a Warner Brothers cartoon is actually in the Puppetoons. Superman is used from DC Comics. He was able to get he had a great public relations with George, with the Hollywood community, because, as I said, not only was he a sweet, wonderful man, he was the most wonderful man. I met him, of course. I knew George, and I was friends with Mrs. Powell for 20 years. So I have a deep involvement with them. But he was loved by the Hollywood community because what he was doing was so different. Everyone was doing cell animation. And to see George's work, and a good story of that is Walt Disney. Walt Disney's working on Snow White, 1934 to 35, 9, that period. He wanted to bring three-dimensionality to animation. And here George comes along with a Puppetoon, and there it is in real time, in 3 dimension, and it blew Walt Disney away, and he had all the Puppetoons shown to all the animators at the studio. And I knew three of the 9 old men at Disney. I've interviewed all of them. Ward Kimball, who created Jiminy Cricket, Mark Davis, who created Tinkerbell, Frank and Ollie Johnson, who did Bambi and Dumbo and Fantasia. Anyway, they all saw the Puppetoons, and they all learned from them, and it influenced the Disney movies. It influenced all their animation. And eventually, as Roy Disney told me, I was a very good friend with Roy for over 30 years, nephew of Walt, it influenced audio animatronics that became Disneyland. It's a Small World is a Puppetoon.
Yeah, okay.
You know,
all right.
So all of the influences of George, it isn't just this, it's this incredible rich history of what these represent and how they influenced the motion picture industry and all these great creative people, you know, and it continues on today, even now. It's amazing.
Were the actual puppets, I mean, these were full-blown wooden hand-carved puppets that he was using?
Yes. Yeah, they're made of, that's the other thing. Very good, Doug. They're made of wood. They're made of wood.
Yeah.
These were carved from wood. And when you look at them, you can't believe that they're moving the way they're moving because they stretch, you know, legs stretch, they move, the arms go up, you know, and the eyes, every frame is a different part, puppet part, you know, and you can't believe it's wood that's being used. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
When we were talking about, you know, how many people were involved to make the shooting of this, how many people were involved just to make the puppets? I mean, there had to be, you think how long it would take to hand carve a puppet, paint it, do the clothes for it, and then you said he had a different puppet for every frame?
Every frame. That's right. You'd have a different head. For instance, let's say an average Puppetoon would have 100 or 200 heads, and each head would be replaced. And then the eyeballs would be replaced, and the mouths would be replaced, and the arms and the legs and the fingers. And then if you had, let's say, a stretch where, let's say in a Warner Brothers cartoon, Roadrunner, let's say, falls from a canyon into the, you know, in the bottom, it stretches out and smashes, where each one of those frames is a separate creation, where the stretch or the smash or the whatever is done frame by frame with a different created carving. So the carving is like a series of carvings. So, you know, I've watched these films frame by frame in stop motion. It's because it's really a wonderful thing today because of the technology. You can do that. You can stop it and you can see frame by frame. You can see, my God, every frame. You're looking at it and you see every carving, you know, it's changing one to the next, to the next, to the next. And you think, oh, my God, they created every one of those. It's just astonishing. You know, it's astonishing. It really is worth just to see that, and you can stop it. You know, like I said, on a DVD or Blu-ray player, you can go frame by frame, you know, and you can see the frames, and you think, oh, my God, it's almost like it's the insanity of almost Frankenstein, you know, to be able to create this, you know. But I've talked to so many people, from Steven Spielberg to George Lucas to Joe Dante, all friends, and they all influenced by the Puppetoons, Peter Jackson, you name it. And it's not so much that it's a effect of the overall effect of the Puppetoons. It's not so much the story; it's the way they're told. It's the level of reality that George was able to create with these stories, with the music, with the story, that is unlike anything. I've said it, but you have to see it to really appreciate the level of reality that George was creating, because it's unlike anything that we're used to. It has a level of fantasy and a charm to them, and almost an old world charm in some respects because of the European influence that just isn't like anything you see anywhere. And that's what makes them so unique. They're just absolutely, well, the Smithsonian has these. I mean, Mrs. Powell donated the puppets to the Smithsonian. I'm going to be doing a show in Washington, D.C. With the Library of Commerce and the American Film Institute, which I was going to bring up next year. They already have these puppets in the Smithsonian. I mean, these are you know, landmark properties that he did that really reside as some of the great works of the 20th century. And they're even noted as that. They're in the library register of the greatest films of all time. You know, they've given them the notoriety. So these are some of the greatest pieces of work ever done in the United States and in American culture. So they're not just your average, you know, animation. I mean, these are the greatest pieces of animation probably ever done in America by an animator. That's the importance of this. It isn't just the cartoon, and why I've been devoted so many years of my life to this is because these represent something really important in the history of cinema. And that's why I've taken it to heart as I've done.
So you were the producer for these, or what did you do? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was the producer and director of the Puppetoon movie. Prior to that, I did a film on George Pal called The Fantasy Film Worlds of George Pal. It's a film on his life, and I interviewed everyone in his life, from Charlton Heston, Rod Taylor, Ray Bradbury, Gene Roddenberry, Roy Disney. Everyone that was involved with George's life is in my film. And the tentacles of his influence is throughout the entire Hollywood. And Cecil B. DeMille, and I was going to mention AFI, by the way. I'm trying to do it quickly without rushing it, but my film, I got the attention of the American Film Institute because of this film. It was landmark when I did it in 1987. It was the first film to premiere at the very first American Film Institute Film Festival. Gene Furstenberg was the president, who replaced George Stevens after he left, and then Gene picked it up as the premiere of the film at that point. And oddly enough, I was invited to George Stevens' film, The Filmmaker's Journey, which I know you interviewed, George.
Yeah.
And he was great, absolutely an icon. And I was there at the Academy, and I went with Mrs. Pal, and I went by limousine with Ruben Mamoulian, who is the great filmmaker of the 1930s, Becky Sharp, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You know, he did so many. He did Silk Stockings with Fred Astaire. I shared the limousine because he's in George's film, was a very close friend of his father's. And that occurred 4 months before, that was at the Academy. That was 4 months before my film premiered at the Academy in the same setting, doing the same thing as a tribute to George Pal, whereas his was a tribute to George Stevens. And so it was kind of interesting because I had that interesting connection to George. But the influence was great. I mean, with my film on George Pal, and got a lot of notoriety because of it. And eventually I went on to do the remake of The Time Machine with Steven Spielberg and Warner Brothers in 2002, which I produced. Which was the big film with Jeremy Irons and Guy Pearce. It's sort of become a cult classic now. It was a very, 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 very interesting film remake of the original Time Machine. So I've been entrenched in this kind of mythology of these films for many, many years.
Well, Arnie, we got to wind this down. Unfortunately, we're just kind of running down on time. Thanks so much for coming on. Is there a website for Puppetoons?
Yeah, it's puppetoon.net. Puppetoon, just like it sounds, Puppeton, puppetoon.net. And then you can see it there. There's also puppetoon.org. Either one will get you to it, and you can review and experience all of these things. That's the best way to do it.
Are there trailers on the website?
Yes, the trailer is on puppetoon.net. There's also a channel on YouTube, like you are. It's the Puppetoon channel, and you can see restoration things that I've done, various clips, various films, so forth. I've posted many things, so all of that can be viewed as well. And it's the beginning of a journey for people when they see it. It's a beginning of a revelation for a lot of people when they see all these things. And I think it should be very exciting, I think, for your viewers, for your listeners.
Did you get them all, or is it going to be a volume 4?
There's going to be a volume 4. And you're getting it first.
Wow, that's great. Well, man, he must have made a lot of these things, yeah? Oh, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk again maybe we'll have time to talk again. So
yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This was really interesting. And
well, thank you.
Best of luck with this.
Thank you, Doug. Look forward to hearing more about your show, the next show you do. Okay, talk to you soon.